Good morning, everyone. It's almost still morning, so we're actually getting started on time for a change. We got a pretty full program. Thank you for coming, Rotarians, guests. I know we've got a few guests. And how many enjoyed having that covered parking garage today? Yoo-hoo. What was that, George? Yeah. Please check your cell phones, make sure they're turned off. Don't want any interruptions. We're going to get Brian Reed, please, to come up and do a reflection. And Matt Arnold, would you please come up and start the Pledge of Allegiance for us? Everyone stand, please. Thanks, Brian. Me first? Yep, you first.
Thank you. Well, hello, fellow Rotarians and guests. Again, I'm Brian Reed. Today, I just offer a simple message of optimism and gratitude for the many blessings that we have, even amidst much pain and suffering throughout our world. If you think about it, optimism and gratitude go together. It's been shown that one of the best ways to foster optimism is to reflect on what we're grateful for. We certainly have many things to be grateful for: our health, our families, our jobs, our experiences that mold and shape us, the food that has been prepared for us today and every week, the opportunity to safely meet again in person and enjoy fellowship and and learn from our outstanding programs. And quite simply, the privilege to be a Rotarian and put service above self. I would say weather, but instead I'll say seasons. Tomorrow is opening day for the Toledo Mud Hens. Always much optimism with any new season. The Mud Hens are undefeated. So tomorrow around this time, downtown Toledo will look much, much different than it does today and for the rest of the day tomorrow. But for me, as a new member, I'm very grateful and humbled to be, for the opportunity to be a Rotarian. I've already met in a short span of a couple of months a number of you and had great camaraderie and even a little bit of professional consultation already. So I look forward to the future as the opportunity to engage more with my fellow Rotarians, serve others, and just try to make a difference in our community and far beyond. Thank you.
You can join me in the pledge, please. Pledge allegiance to the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Matt. And both new members, so make sure you say hello to them. And it's good that they're getting up front so you can see who they are. I'd also like to thank Brightview Health, April's monthly sponsor. And thank you, Rotarian Jean Dries. Would anyone like to introduce any visiting Rotarians or guests, please? You can go to the floor mic. You got a guest. You going to introduce your guest?
Yes, I'm introducing Susan, my wife.
Yeah, use the floor mic by Chuck Stocking there.
It's too high for me. Oh, there you go. Two guests I have, Susan, my wonderful wife, and Rob Vincent, a great friend and a patriot.
Welcome, Susan. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Mr. President and fellow Rotarians. It's my honor to introduce to you today Sherry Ferguson. She's business development with Kuzno Restoration, and she just walked in today to join us and learn more about Rotary. So I encourage all of you to stop and say hello to her and encourage her to join us.
Welcome, Sherry. I know your boss quite well. He's also a member here, although I haven't seen him. All right, is that all we got for visitors? If I could ask Kevin Mullen, please, to come up and introduce new Rotarian Tony Washington, who, if you've been to the meetings before, you've probably met Tony. and he actually gave a presentation a couple months ago. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President Bob. He just basically gave pretty much half of my remarks in those 2 sentences, so thank you for that. My fellow Rotarians, it's my pleasure to introduce new Rotarian Tony Washington. As Bob said, many of you recognize Tony for his regular attendance since joining the club officially a few months ago, or when he presented to our club on behalf of Bitwise Industries back in November. Tony serves as the Business Development Manager for Bitwise. At home, Tony and his partner Elizabeth have a 3-year-old daughter, Noelle. He enjoys volleyball, squash, hiking, and he says anything that he can do with his family. Tony grew up in California before moving to the Dayton, Ohio area, where he was recruited to play football for the best team in the state, the University of Toledo. You guys think I was going to say something else? He played defense for 4 years for the Rockets. He currently serves on the EPIC Toledo Advisory Board, the Toledo Racial Equity and Inclusion Council, the Advisory Board for the Ohio Virtual Academy, and on the Owens Community College Summer Cybersecurity Camp Planning Committee. He doesn't have a whole lot going on. What Tony might not realize is that while he was playing for the Rockets, I was announcing for the Rockets for every single one of his football games. So for old time's sake, Rotarians, just humor me for a second. It's my pleasure to introduce at cornerback from Fairborn High School, number 13, Tony Washington.
Welcome. That's your pin. Thanks. Don't forget the pin. Thanks, Kevin, and welcome, Tony. Glad to have you as a member. Now I'd like to introduce Ed Caldwell, and he is going to make an announcement, and this is a real opportunity for involvement, and it's a really good time, and he'll tell you all about it.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Rotarians. Many of you have been associated with the Glendale Fieldbach relationship that the Rotary Club has had for so many years. We've been to the zoo, we've been to Fifth Third Field, and usually the St. Francis students help with that event. They're going to help with that event again this year. I think we have about 88 students from the school coming this year, but instead of the zoo or Fifth Third Field, they're coming to Camp Miaconda. So they're going to do some activities that a Cub Scout or a Boy Scout would do when they're at camp. So we're really excited about that. It will be April 12th. We'd like to have you mark your calendars for that day. We're going to be there from 9:30 until 1 o'clock. A little bit of archery, maybe some BB gun shooting at the ranges. We're going to do some fishing and some initiative games. In a different term, some team building. So, and then we'll close with lunch that day. The typical Cub Scout luncheon like we had today. Chicken nuggets and maybe some dessert and some things like that. So again, mark your calendars. We could really use some Rotarians to help out. Like I said, we have the St. Francis students coming. I'm not exactly sure. Cindy, how do they sign up if they want to participate and be there that day?
There'll be a link in this book, and I think Jackie will be sending out an email for everyone to have an.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you all very much.
One more question?
Yes.
How's the parking out there? Will we all park out front and then shuttle
will-
back, or how you?
You'll
how you gonna
all
work
park
that?
out front, and then you just walk across the bridge, and you'll be on the main parade field, which is where a lot of the initiative games are taking place. It's an easy walk. Thanks, Bob.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Ed. I really encourage people to participate in some of our activities with the youth. It's really rewarding, and it's real interesting too. You'll get more out of it than the kids probably. Next, I would like to introduce Roy Cherry. I think Roy is here, is he not? And he's going to talk about our Working Better Together program. And that's where we have several agencies, and you're going to talk about that, I'm assuming, the cooperative. And he's got a candidate here.
Thank you, President Bob. So I'm stepping in for Goodwill Industries. This would have been their time to speak. So I am the chair of the Disability Services Committee, and within our committee, we've developed a Working Better Together initiative where Goodwill, Epilepsy Center, a lot of industries, and the Ability Center have come together to help individuals with disabilities find work and employment. And so we thought it would be a great time. So each first Monday meeting of the month, one of us gets up here and we get to introduce somebody that is looking for a position. This individual, Adron Johnson, is not here. He did not feel comfortable coming here and getting up here, but he has nearly 20 years of tax preparation experience, and he's interested in some administrative aid office work and learning new office type software programs and to that nature. So if anybody is interested in knowing more about Adron, you can contact Megan at Goodwill Industries. I think we'll make sure that Jackie has that information, but her phone number is 419-255-0070. But we'll make sure we have that information out there. And then one other note, the last time when Tim was up here last month, introduced a gentleman, he did find employment. He wanted some landscaping employment. He was able to find some, was not through a Rotary member, but him being here and getting up here with Tim really empowered him and gave him a lot of good confidence so that he was able to go out there and find himself a job. So I was really happy to hear that. So we're making some headway on getting some people with disabilities some employment. So, okay, thank you.
Thanks, Roy. Maybe we can get the candidates to come in next time, and don't be afraid to bring more than one if we've got time for a couple. Next, Scott Hinshaw. Would you please come up and tell us about the food pack? And it's another great opportunity for fellowship, and you're really doing something good.
Again, got the speech. I'm done. So April 9th is the food pack. It's this Saturday, so it is now here. Rotarians, we have put in, I think, a grant of $3,500 for it. We also had some wonderful Rotarians who stepped up and donated more. So I think we have contributed now at least 5,000, if not greater, to the food pack for this weekend. It's going to be at St. John's, and it starts at 8 a.m. There's an early session, and there's an afternoon session that starts at 10:30. I think the 10:30 one is full. Someone just told me today. Carol just told me. So if you can sign up for the 8 to 10:30, that'd be great. If you can't show up at 8, 8:30, 9 is fine too. I'm sure we can work you in. If you don't want to sign up online, I did bring a sheet with me, and if you want to put your name on that sheet, it's just outside the door with Jackie, and I will make sure that you get on the list. So again, that's this weekend, and we're really looking forward to a great project. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. And again, I encourage everyone to sign up. They are really interesting and fun. And good fellowship, it's not just our Rotary Club, it's, I don't know, how many, Scott? I think there's at least 4 clubs, but yeah, the district is supporting it. Okay. I don't have too many announcements today. Remember the car raffle through the district, and that's always in the spoke. There's a link to it. It's an electric car, and with gas prices where they are, it might be a good deal. Other than that, I'm going to skip right to Yuval, who's going to introduce our speaker, Yoram Ettinger. And when we get to questions at the end, please no long narratives or introductions. Get right to your question, because we want to have time for answers. Thanks. I shouldn't have to say that, but I do.
President Bob and my fellow Rotarians, the Middle East never behaves according to concepts and Western concepts. My wife and I, 3 weeks ago, flew from Tel Aviv to Dubai on an Arab airline over the airspace of Saudi on our Israeli passports, and that if you told me that that will happen 2 years ago, if that will happen, I would laugh it off. If you tell me that the current administration is trying to resuscitate the two-state solution and negotiate with Iran, I laugh it off. It's not going to happen. And when President Trump announced his intention to recognize Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, the world and the media said, oh, the whole Arab world will explode. What happened? They signed peace with Israel. So to comment about these things, there's no more qualified person than Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, who is the most knowledgeable commentator in Israel, both on printed and broadcast media. I am very proud to introduce him to you.
Thank you very much. There's a story which goes back to the days of the Roman Empire, when people used to be thrown into the arena, the Colosseum, to fight lions. And one of those poor persons is there alone in the arena, surrounded by a wild crowd yelling, blood, blood. And he's no fool. And he realized there's no chance for him to overcome the lion. So he decided to pray. He knelt down, he covered his eyes with his hands, and he prayed, and he heard the dungeon gate open. He heard the lion roaming towards him, and the crowd getting wilder and wilder. And suddenly, silence. In fact, divine silence. He said, well, I must be dead. But then, he said, if I can reflect, I'm alive. So he opened one eye, he was astounded. The lion was lying 2 feet away from him, covering its paws, its eyes with its paws. And the person said, wow, it worked, miracle. And he said, psst, psst, lion, are you also praying? And the lion said, hell yes, I'm saying grace. And it seems to me that on too many occasions, this is how the West is treated by some rogue regimes from the third world, which take Western policymakers for an easy ride. We see it today with Iran, where the US and the West Europeans assume that Iran is susceptible or amenable to peaceful coexistence with their Sunni Arab neighbors, that they are amenable to abandoning their 1400-year-old vision of imperialistic vision, in fact, of subjugating the world to their own style of Shiite Islam. And they assume that the Ayatollahs of Iran are in principle good faith negotiators, ignoring the actual track record, which is anything but good faith negotiator. And not only track record in the Gulf or in the Middle East, but track record globally speaking, and recently more and more in South and Central America, aiming at what they call the Great American Satan, including intense collaboration with the major drug cartels of Mexico and Colombia and Bolivia, collaboration with every single anti-American government in Latin America, led by Venezuela, but also Cuba and Nicaragua and Ecuador and Bolivia and Chile recently, and certainly coordinating their actions with Latin American terror organization, mostly from bases which the Ayatollahs of Iran have established, by the way, together with Hezbollah terrorists from Lebanon and Syria. Both of them have been entrenched in Latin America since the early 1980s, primarily in the trilateral border areas of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, and Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. And in those areas, the Ayatollahs have maintained training camps for terrorists. They have maintained what they call religious seminaries aimed at proselytizing, converting Sunni Muslims to Shiite Islam and Christians to Shiite Islam. Some of the terrorists trained there are sent to the Middle East. Some remain there. And recently also, the Ayatollahs of Iran have exported equipment for building tunnels, which is used for building tunnels between the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza. That's the venue for smuggling into Gaza advanced missiles to hit Israel. They try to do the same thing between Mexico and the US, but still defined as potentially good faith negotiator. When you examine the track record on the one hand and the assumption that they are potentially good faith negotiator, it seems to me you encounter a classic oxymoron, which does not work in favor of America's best national security interest and homeland security interests. This is a clear and present danger to every single Arab ally of the US. All of them have the machete of the Ayatollahs and the Muslim Brotherhood at their throat, primarily Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, as well as Egypt and Jordan and Bahrain. And certainly in face of such an enemy, potential enemy, which does not hide its agenda, does not camouflage its agenda, and they declare it publicly. The agenda is to subjugate the great American Satan. In face of such a threat, Europe cannot be relied on. Europe has been vacillating in recent years. Some refer to NATO as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but some suggest that was the far, far past. Currently, NATO stands for no action, talk only. Ask the Ukrainians and they will tell you something about it. And certainly the US cannot rely on its Arab allies in face of Iran, because those Arab allies are threatened for their survival by the far superior Iran. There is one country upon which a growing number of Sunni Arab countries rely on, and that's Israel. That's the reason that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, with the critical support, even push by the Saudis, who, for, in my mind, domestic reasons, are unable to sign right now peace treaty with Israel, but there's no doubt it was the Saudis pushing that led United Arab Emirates and Bahrain to sign peace treaty with Israel, not because they found out suddenly that the Jews are serious when they say peace, but because of Israel's posture of deterrence. And when they look around and ask themselves, who can we rely on? Well, on the US, sometimes. Depends who is at the White House. Depends on foreign national security policy. Depends on the way they approach Iran. Europeans, they cannot rely on. The only country upon which they rely on, so they think, is Israel, the only effective life insurance agent in the region. And again, it has to do with Israel's posture of deterrence, which has been extremely useful for America as well. And it has been useful going back to 1967. Most of you, all of you are aware of that war, the 6 Days War, and some claim this is a war of occupation, and some claim this is a war of liberation. But from the US national security interest, that war, where Israel obliterated, didn't defeat, but obliterated the military power of Egypt, at that time the #1 ally of the USSR in the Middle East, threatening the survival of Saudi Arabia especially, and other pro-American Arab countries. Once we obliterated the military infrastructure of Egypt, we spared the US a major national security avalanche. And mind you, 67, US was highly dependent on the importation of oil from the Persian Gulf. We spared the US major economic calamity, and at the same time, we denied the Soviets a major national security bonanza. This was not the only time that Israel provided the US such a unique service, which no other country ever accorded the USA. But if you take it fast forward to 1981, Israel bombed and destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor. By the way, in defiance of American pressure, in defiance of American punishment, which followed that bombing, because we were perceived at that time by the White House, by the State Department, by the New York Times and Washington Post as modern-day pirates. Who are you to bomb somebody else's nuclear reactor? And it took the US number of years before admitting publicly that it was a service, a rare service to US national security, and that took place after the first Gulf War. 10 years later, January 1991, when US fought Saddam Hussein after the invasion of Kuwait, there was a major defense establishment event in Washington. I was at that time at the Israeli embassy in charge of our congressional relations. The keynote speaker was then Defense Secretary Dick Cheney. And the first sentence by Dick Cheney was, "Thank you, Israel, for bombing Iraq's nuclear reactor in 1981, which spared the US and the world a nuclear confrontation in 1991. Now, how many lives were spared by that Israeli bombing in 1981? How many billions and billions of dollars were spared by such a decision by Israel? Again, in defiance of America's pressure. In fact, the morning after that evening statement by Dick Cheney, Secretary of State Jim Baker, to put it mildly, was not exactly one of Israel's admirers. He was very, very upset with Dick Cheney. Why did you have to say that, and why in public? But the fact is that once again, Israel proved its contribution, its potential for US national security. And certainly a year later, 1982, Israel was busy fighting the Palestinian terrorists in Lebanon. There was a problem because on the border of Lebanon and Syria, in the Lebanese valley, the Soviets decided to position 30 of their top creme de la creme surface-to-air missile batteries, which were deemed at that time by the Americans as impossible to penetrate, and they were stationed throughout the globe. The Israeli Air Force designated a method through which to penetrate those missile batteries. In the process, we destroyed all of them, and in the process, there were some dogfights. We downed 83 Soviet MiGs without losing a single American plane, which we flew then as we fly today. It took exactly a week before the battle tactic, which was followed by Israel, was shared with the Americans, which changed completely the global balance of power, because overnight, those Soviet advanced ground-to-air missiles were rendered next to useless by that technology, by that Israeli tactic. We had, by the way, a few years before that, the transformation of power in Iran from pro-US Iran under the Shah of Iran, the American policeman of the Gulf, to the number one enemy of the US, the number one epicenter of global terrorism, the Ayatollahs of Iran. And that change of power demonstrated the fragility of the Middle East in particular, the world in general, as we see now between Russia and Ukraine, the unpredictability of alliances, because overnight the Shah was toppled and the Iranians became adversaries, enemies of the US, compared to the 100% reliability of Israel, be it a left of center, right of center coalition in Israel. The US is assured. We are talking about systematically pro-US Israel, which is highly effective and certainly the only democracy in the Middle East. In 2003, Turkey changed its colors with Erdogan rising to power, and again overnight from a major, maybe the major ally of the US in the area between the Middle East and Europe, Turkey became, to put it mildly, a most problematic entity as far as American interests are concerned, and certainly a rival, potentially also an enemy of the US, which once again shed light on the unique role played by Israel. 2007, Israel bombed the Syrian nuclear reactor once again. The administration was pretty disenchanted with such a lawless, supposedly, action, but one may only imagine what would the cost be to regional and global stability, what would the impact be on the piles and piles and piles of fatalities if the current civil war in Syria would also involve nuclear capabilities in Syria, all of which was spared by Israel's decision to do the right thing, irrespective of its popularity, irrespective of political correctness. Those are few of the contributions rendered by Israel, which in fact, right now you see it on an ongoing basis. When I talk about ongoing basis, only a few months ago in October of 2021, and before that in 2020, Israel alerted the US to an Iranian plan to hit with missiles two American military bases, one in Syria, one in Iraq. The US was alerted by Israel. The 200 American soldiers in one base in Syria, 1,500 in Iraq, did find shelter. The missiles hit those bases, but the life of the American soldiers was spared by Israel sharing its intelligence with the US. When I spoke with a former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and we discussed US-Israel collaboration in the area of intelligence, the statement I heard from the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee was the scope of intelligence shared by Israel with the US exceeds that which the US receives from all NATO countries combined. what exactly is the dollar sign that you put next to that, but we certainly don't talk about 100 million or hundreds of million. We're talking about very, very substantial contribution there. Former chief of the U.S. Air Force Intelligence, General George Keegan, who was a very enthusiastic supporter of expanded cooperation with Israel, when he was asked, how would you, thank you very much. Thank you. That's Rotarian hospitality. When General George Keegan was asked, why are you so hot about Israel? His response was, if the U.S. were to procure the intelligence which we receive from Israel, the U.S. would have to establish 5 CIAs. As some of you may know, the annual budget of the CIA is roughly $15 billion. It puts in perspective what is misperceived, erroneously perceived as foreign aid to Israel, the $3.8 billion annually transferred for Israel's acquisition of American military hardware. It's not foreign aid. It's an annual investment in Israel. And the question is there or isn't there return on investment, and how high or how low is that investment? If you're talking about annual budget of CIA, there we're talking about already over 400% rate of return. If you were to visit the defense contractors manufacturing combat planes in this country, you would find out that Israel always receives the first batch of planes. Not because we have a strong lobby for that. It's because the Americans realize Israel has been, going back to 67, we have been the most important battle-tested laboratory for the American defense industry and for the American armed forces. Every time we receive American combat planes, we fly them due to our needs in the area on under battle condition. When you fly it under battle condition, you learn many, many lessons, which we share literally on a daily basis through an Israeli team, which is on site, whether it's Lockheed Martin in Fort Worth, Texas, whether it's McDonnell Douglas in Missouri, the F-15. We share it every single day. And those lessons are integrated into the next generation of the F-15 or F-16 or F-35, and those upgrades into those planes spare the manufacturers, the defense industry, many, many years of research and development. As I was told by one of the managers in Fort Worth, Texas, the F-16 and F-35, that we are talking about mega billion-dollar bonanza, to quote him, to the manufacturer, because it's about 10 to 20 years of R&D, and as people know here, to research and conduct research and development with regard to combat planes, we are talking about mega billion dollars, but it also enhances the competitiveness of the U.S. in the global market, namely it increases exports by the U.S. defense industry, and in the process expands the employment base of the defense industry. We are using in Israel, we are using a few hundred military systems. And each one we use under battlefield conditions. And each one we conclude lessons which we share with the Americans. And not only because we feel at home with America, which we have felt since establishment of Israel, but primarily because we want next time to get a better generation of F-16 or F-15 or the tank or the missile launcher. And in the process, we provide the Americans the highest ROI on any investment ever made by the United States. I don't want to take any more time from the most important part, Q&A, so I'll just conclude with a football metaphor. You have a former football star here, and I would say that when the team is 5 points behind, and it's 10 seconds to the end of the fourth quarter, the end of the game, and the ball is on the 30-yard line of the other team, the American quarterback should know it can rely on the Israeli wide receiver to receive the ball and score the winning touchdown. By the way, not only questions, I would even rather have your own opinion, and certainly any disagreement with whatever I said would be welcomed. Yes.
First of all, great talk.
Thank you.
My comments, that's a very complex issue, and the chance for peace are almost minimal. But my question is at a human level, what are the prospects that Israel will invest money in West Bank and, if at all possible, in Gaza Strip to develop their economies? And as the economies develop, there'll be less chance of violence, more education. So what are the prospects for that? Because if you compare the two areas, they are really truly a third world area as compared to Israel.
Okay, thank you very much. We have attempted to do just that when we signed the Oslo Accord with the Palestine Liberation Organization, the Palestinian terrorist organization, and we even imported to the heart of Israel 100,000 Palestinian terrorists from terrorist camps in Tunisia and Yemen and Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, led by Arafat and that time his deputy Mahmoud Abbas, who is now the chairman. And that was supposed to transform the life of the Palestinians. Contrary to the very, very naive and reckless expectations by the Israeli leaders who conceived that policy, upon arriving to Samaria in the north of the West Bank, or Judea in the south, or the strip of Gaza, they did not dedicate themselves and the very, very substantial economic financial assistance from Israel, but primarily from the US, towards butter. They directed it towards gun, namely terrorism. And terrorism escalated dramatically in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords, not years later, days later. And the assumption that the Palestinians are now going to be preoccupied with education and administration and welfare and health and medicine, and therefore will not have time to deal with terrorism, was crashed against the rocks of reality, as, by the way, happens now with the US policy towards Iran. Westerners tend to underestimate the dedication of different people to their own culture, which is different from Western culture. And people in the Middle East, leaders of Arab and Muslim countries, are not going to depart from their strongly held visions, most of them going back to the 7th century, in return for a very tempting financial or diplomatic package. We in the West, whether it's US, Israel, Europe, we tend to assume that the most important thing is peaceful coexistence and human rights and democracy and standard of living. Well, we are a minority in the real world. It's not very pleasant to hear that, but again, turn to Russia and Ukraine, what was expected, and suddenly what are we exposed to? Because people tended to ignore the very, very devious vision that Putin has about Russia and how is Ukraine integrated into this, this vision. The same applies to Palestinians. In 2005, 12 years later, after 1993, Israel decided to uproot Jewish communities from Gaza, to evacuate Gaza from any civilian and military presence. And in fact, we left behind hut houses which were the pride of Israel as far as exporting flowers and vegetables to Europe. What did the Palestinians do with the homes that we left behind and with the hut houses? They neglected it, and instead they started shelling missiles at Israel. We had so far, since we made this devastating mistake, we had so far 4 major wars, exposing Jerusalem and Tel Aviv to the Palestinian missiles, which never took place until we made that gesture. But this should not have surprised any Israeli or any American observer, because this has been the Palestinian conduct from day one. In the 1950s, they were hosted by Egypt, and very soon they collaborated with Muslim Brotherhood Sunni terrorism inside Egypt, trying to topple the central regime in Cairo. And they fled Egypt, Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and their friends. Syria absorbed them, but then they terrorized Syria in 1966. They fled Syria. They were absorbed in Jordan. They tried to topple central regime in Jordan, which exploded into a civil war in September 1970, and they fled to Lebanon. They plundered southern Lebanon. They tried to take over Beirut, which triggered a series of civil wars. And in 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he did that with the assistance of 3 Palestinian Arafat-controlled battalions. At that time, Kuwait, the #1, the most generous host of Palestinians anywhere in the Arab world. They allowed 400,000 Palestinians to settle in Kuwait. They allowed them to rise to top positions in the area of administration and government and business and media and academia. And in return, they were stabbed in the back, because historically the track record shows us that Palestinian terrorists tend to bite the hand that feeds them. In fact, it's not only Palestinian terrorists. Look what happened to the US in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan were able to defeat the Soviet Union because of the USA. What was the Mujahideen response? Among other things, September 11, and later on, Islamic terrorism all over, including inside the US itself. This is the nature of terrorists. They do bite the hand that feeds them, and they benefit from the naivete of the Western world, including Israel, which says they must think like us. They must vie for better standard of living. And when one talks about providing opportunities, there is something which escapes the attention of the media. I happen to be involved in a study of Arab demography west of the Jordan River, and there is an interesting element there. Jordan asserted its laws in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank in April of 1950, after the 1948-49 Israel's War of Independence. They applied their law and they ruled the area until 1967. During those 17 years, the population, the Arab population of the West Bank of Judea and Samaria grew by meager 1%. because Jordan never trusted the Palestinians. Jordan did not invest substantially in the employment, infrastructure, transportation, education, health, medicine. They wanted to empty the area as fast as possible. The scope of emigration by Arabs on the West Bank during those 7 years was more or less equal to the number of births at that time. This is an exception anywhere in the world. However, 67, Israel took over control of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and we ruled it exclusively until 1993. During those years of Israel's control, exclusive control, emigration shifted from fifth gear to first or second gear. The numbers came down dramatically for a reason. Israel started investing in infrastructure, medical, health, transportation, business, education. There was less inducement to go out and look for a job in the Persian Gulf or West Africa or Latin America. It impacted infant mortality, which came down almost to the Jewish level. Life expectancy zoomed upward almost to the Jewish level. In fact, it's very similar to American level. Men 78, women 82. And emigration, as I said, came to almost standstill. The outcome, the population growth during the years of Israel's exclusive control, 1967 through 1993, the highest ever in the history of Arabs in Judea and Samaria. Obviously, those who lash at Israel's so-called apartheid, etc., don't know about it, they don't want to know about it, and those who know in the media do not publish that. And by the way, you can see it when you travel in Judea, Samaria, and you visit different villages and different towns. It's very, very different than what is misrepresented by the media. I wish the answer to terrorism would be economy. And this is the deadly mistake by this administration, which assumes Ayatollahs' terrorism is driven by frustration and despair. I wish it were true, but if it were true, the world would be not the same as we have on hand. Namely, there is a reason why there is no new world order. There is a constant world disorder. Apparently, those very tempting formulas do not apply to reality, sadly. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, one question. Is there a strategy that Israel promotes that brings humanity together as opposed to identifying all these things that separate humanity? Rotary's about service above self, a unifying global theme that has done amazing things. So I'd be interested in what you have to say on that.
I don't consider myself a specialist on social issues, but my gut reaction is that humanity benefits from diversity. And diversity should not mean conflict and should not mean animosity, but to act in order to eliminate diversity brings much injustice and certainly deprives humanity of the contribution that different people can contribute. And I think we practice it very much so in Israel. Politics in Israel is highly frustrating, especially because each one has his or her own opinion within the party, outside the party. Therefore, we have multitude of parties. But I would rather have such highly diversified political system than a despot-like regime, which almost all of our neighbors are burdened with. Thank you very much.
It's like a walking history book. Thank you. 1 second here. I would like to present you with a book, Historical Tales of Toledo, and it's by one of our past presidents, Clint Mock, And it'll tell you some things you never would have guessed about Toledo, some other history for you. And we would also like to make a donation to the Polio Plus Fund in your name. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Perhaps he can stick around if you have some questions after we're done. We're almost done here. Chuck, are you available to do your video? Sure. We have just enough time. I keep preempting him, so he loves it.
My favorite president. This needs no introduction, but people always do it anyway. So I'm not going to. Is that one ready? It's the first Monday of the month, so it's a...
The story is about the man and his wife sitting having breakfast. Very nice couple. And the man said, Margaret, no, it was the other way around. Margaret said to John, John, if I would die, would you get married right away after my death? But John said, well, that's the darndest thing. Here's a beautiful morning and we're sitting here having a nice breakfast together, and you bring up this terrible thing about death. I'm not going to talk to you. That's a terrible thing to do, Margaret. And I forget about it. But she didn't forget about it. She brought the same thing up that night. And he did the same thing. And then for about 3 days, she said, now, what, if I would die, would you get married? Finally, he gave up, and he said, one night, she said, if I would die, would you get married again? He said, yes, I would. No, is that settled? She said, would you sell the house? He said, no, I wouldn't sell the house. She said, would you sell our bed? He said, no, I wouldn't. It's our bed. I don't see any reason why. No, I wouldn't sell the bed. She said, well, you certainly wouldn't let her touch my golf clubs. And he said, no, she's left-handed.
Thank you once again, Chuck. Please join us next week, April 11th, right here in this same room. Randy Box will be speaking about Mesa, and Randy is an assistant governor. He's a president-elect of the Waterville Club. I think he's been president there before. He's been in Mesa many years, and he has run the Mesa Bike Tour for maybe the last 10. And I may be forced to dress up in my bike jersey next week. I don't think I'll have my tight pants on, but you never know.
Those who want to stay and talk a little more with the ambassador, we have the time. So.
Okay. Yeah, if you'd like to speak. One other meeting coming up here, the committee chair grant review is going to be probably somewhere in one of these corners of this room. And PE Cindy and Jackie will be hosting that. And so if you don't have questions for Ambassador Ettinger, or if you're not at the committee chair grant review meeting, please shuffle on out of here. With that, thanks again. We're adjourned.